Alright, what is up my homies? Welcome to Brainmelt University. After our last video discussing transmission media, I figured this was a good time to segue into one of the worst parts about IT, and that is memorization hell with standards. When it comes to standards bodies, there is no one bigger in the game than the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers. By far, when we're talking about different standards that you have to learn about and memorize, the IEEE standardizes and specifies most of them, the vast majority of them, especially when it comes to computer networking. In the computer networking world, there is no bigger standard than the IEEE 802 standard. Virtually any technology that has anything to do with computer networking or the internet in general is encompassed by the 802 standard. Now, there are several substandards underneath this, and each of those substandards undergoes many revisions as these technologies progress and are updated to include better performance, better security, and just other general improvements. Before we get into these, I do want to just throw in a quick reminder to like, subscribe, hit the notification bell, share with your friends, and comment down below. All of these things help the YouTube algorithm and help make us a better resource for you in the future. With all that out of the way, let's get started. The IEEE 802 standard has several different revisions, substandards, etc., but the major ones that we worry about in computer networking are the 802.1, 802.3, 802.11, 802.15, and 802.16. And if your brain isn't about to explode yet, well, let's start diving into each of these. What I like to tell my students is that the 802.1 standard is kind of a catch-all standard. This is a standard that is media independent, meaning that this could work on a wired Ethernet connection or a wireless Wi-Fi connection or a Bluetooth connection. These are generally standards that don't necessarily have to deal with the transmission of data, but they may have to deal with how that data is used or how access is provided to a network. When it comes to the 802.1 standard, there are several revisions that we need to keep our eyes on. The major one that we deal with is 802.1Q. 802.1Q is how we tag individual traffic to determine which VLAN it is supposed to go on. If a switch doesn't know which VLAN a particular frame belongs to, it's not going to be able to send it to the proper host. With 802.1Q, we're able to apply a VLAN tag to an Ethernet frame or to a Wi-Fi frame in order to make this work. Another big one that you run into is 802.1x. 802.1x is often lumped in with radius, which is slightly different, but they are both used hand in hand in order to provide access to a network. All of your open standard spanning tree protocols are part of the 802.1 umbrella. So your original spanning tree was 802.1d, rapid spanning tree was 802.1w, and multiple spanning tree was 802.1s. I will link my videos on AAA standards like 802.1x and spanning tree protocol in the description below so that you can get caught up if you're not familiar with either of those protocols yet. Moving on with 802 standards, the biggest one that we worry about by far is 802.3. 802.3 is the Ethernet standard. Everything related to Ethernet is encompassed in the 802.3 standard. This applies to all technology that's Ethernet related, whether we're talking about power over Ethernet or we're talking about the different Ethernet speed revisions. When it comes to the 802.3 standard, there's several that we have to memorize. If we're discussing Ethernet standards specific to power over Ethernet, which is a technology that allows you to send an electrical signal across an Ethernet cable and physically power a device that may not have an electrical power outlet nearby. The three major IEEE standards related to power over Ethernet are the 802.3AF, 802.3AT, and 802.3BT standards. Each of these revisions provides different amounts of electrical current and may or may not send signal across different wire pairs within a typical twisted pair Ethernet cable. If we're talking about revisions related to Ethernet speed itself, the major ones that we have to memorize are 802.3U, which specifies fast Ethernet, 802.3Z, which specifies gigabit fiber optic connections, 802.3AB, which is gigabit copper cabling, and 802.3AE, which is typically 10 gigabit fiber optic Ethernet cabling. 802.3BA is the current standard which encompasses virtually any speed or technology that operates at higher than 10 gigabit speed. So your 40 gigabit and 100 gigabit connections are all operating under the umbrella of the 802.3ba standard. Has your brain melted yet? Mine sure has. Let's move on to the 802.11 standard. 802.11 is all things Wi-Fi related. 802.11 encompasses many technologies and many standards, and I'm really only going to be listing the major revisions that have to deal with the different speeds and the frequency bands that these different standards utilize. However, do keep in mind that there are other 802.11 standards and way more 802.3 standards and 1 standards that I haven't mentioned in this video. These are just the major ones that you can expect to find on virtually any certification exam. The 802.11a and b standards both came out in the same year, and both were kind of competing standards. Both of these operated on different frequency bands, which meant that both of them required a different set of radios and antennas in order to operate. If you bought an A laptop, you couldn't connect it to a B router, or vice versa. The 802.11a standard had a lot of good things going for it. It used the 5 GHz frequency band. This means that with more cycles per second, it's easier to transmit more data per second with a 5 GHz band compared to 802.11b, which used the 2.4 GHz band. However, there's a major drawback to using the 5 GHz band, and that is that it doesn't do too well when you have a lot of obstacles to get through. The 2.4 GHz band, even though it is way more saturated and was even back in the 1990s when these standards were first specified, 2.4 GHz is capable of dealing with obstacles like walls, windows, and doorways a lot easier than it is than the 5 GHz band. This meant that even though 802.11a operated at a speed of 54 megabits per second and 2.4 operated at 11 megabits per second, there were benefits and drawbacks to both. I mean, this is the 1990s where most people were on 56K dial-up. If you were actually pulling 11 megabits per second, you were a freaking god anyway. When it came time to update the 802.11 standard, the 802.11g standard took the best of both worlds. The 802.11g standard used the 2.4 GHz frequency that 802.11b did, but they were able to upgrade the radios to the point where they could operate at the same bandwidth as 802.11a. Therefore, 802.11g operated on the 2.4 GHz frequency band, and it was able to transmit up to 54 megabits per second, which again, this was the late 90s, early 2000s, where those speeds were practically unheard of in most US households. However, there was a major problem. If you had any A equipment, you could not upgrade to 802.11g without replacing everything. Because 802.11g operated on the 2.4 GHz frequency, it was only backwards compatible with 802.11b equipment. So if you had all 802.11b equipment, you could make the upgrade to 802.11g perfectly seamlessly. All of your older equipment is still going to operate at that maximum bandwidth of 11 megabits per second, but as you upgrade your stuff, it's going to be able to utilize the newer G standard. However, if you used 802.11a, you had absolutely no reason to upgrade to G other than maybe security concerns. You would have to replace all of your equipment or buy adapters that utilize the proper radios in order to make these work. This is why when in the mid-2000s the 802.11n standard came out, everything changed. Even though it introduced a lot of innovations, 802.11 brought a lot of upgrades and backwards compatibility to the rest of the 802.11 standards. The major advantage that 802.11n had over G, A, or B is that it possessed both radios. If you had a device that was 802.11n approved, it was capable of operating at both the 2.4 and 5 GHz bands. Not only that, it could utilize both of these bands at the exact same time. By utilizing both the 2.4 and the 5 GHz, you could pick and choose between something that might have to travel a longer distance through more obstacles, or something that's going to provide you better bandwidth because you're right next to your router or something like that. In addition to being backwards compatible with all pre-existing 802.11 standards, 802.11n brought a major step up when it comes to bandwidth. Now, depending on whose textbook you read, this can range anywhere from 544 megabits per second all the way up to 600 megabits per second. This is made even more fantastic when you think of the fact that this is a mid-2000s technology, and here in the 2020s, the majority of United States citizens still do not have full gigabit in their house, meaning 802.11n was capable of providing more bandwidth then than we still require today. But 802.11n has aged, and it does pose many security risks if you're still using it. So even if you don't need the speed offered by newer 802.11 standards, it is still a good idea to upgrade your equipment in order to protect yourself against malicious activity. 11n is probably one of the longest surviving wireless standards. It operated the longest before it was replaced, and it's still in use today by people who just absolutely refuse to upgrade. But all good things do have to come to an end, and that is why 802.11n was eventually deprecated in favor of the 802.11ac standard. 11ac brought many different innovations back to the table and improved even upon 802.11n technologies. And it even improved upon technologies that were brought in at the same time as 802.11n, like MIMO, upgrading it to multiple user MIMO or MU-MIMO. Mu-me-my-mo-mu. Oh, sorry. 802.11ac actually saw several sub-revisions or waves when they were introduced. Wave 1 802.11ac operated at a maximum bandwidth of about 1.3 gigabits per second. 1.3 gigabits per second is quite fast by American standards, and for most, this is all you really need. If you're buying Wave 2 and Wave 3, it's either because you have a lot of customers who all need to access the same device, or you don't understand the concept of a data bottleneck. One major limitation of 802.11ac is that it only operates on the 5 gigahertz frequency. But you'll notice that if you go to Amazon and just search for 802.11ac adapter or router or anything using those terms, you're gonna see a lot of stuff marketed as dual band, even though dual band means you have both the 2.4 and the 5 gigahertz frequency. Well, thankfully, a lot of manufacturers of this equipment do realize that there are a number of people who still use the 2.4 gigahertz frequency band. Some super cheap equipment that was manufactured during the 802.11n period only possess 2.4 gigahertz radios. In order to stay backwards compatible, basically a lot of these manufacturers upgrade the 5 gigahertz radio to be in line with the current 802.11ac standards, but they still throw in the 2.4 gigahertz radio from the 802.11n standard. This still gives you full backwards compatibility, but technically, according to the standard, 2.4 is not specified whatsoever in the 802.11ac standard. Wave 2 AC brought the bandwidth up to about 4.6 to 4.7 gigabits per second, and Wave 3 upgraded all the way to between 9 and 10 gigabits. The most common range that I see is about 9.3 gigabits per second as far as the speed. Now, I do want to point out, because I actually had a student bring this information to me, but there is another standard that was competing with 802.11ac, and that was the 802.11ad standard. 802.11ac Wave 1 and AD were both very similar, but AD specified a third frequency band, which was the 60 gigahertz band. 60 gigahertz is extremely high compared to anything that we use in the United States, thanks to the fellas at the freaking FCC. If you operate in the United States, by definition, the 60 gigahertz radio does have to be disabled in order to be in compliance with FCC rules and guidelines. Therefore, an 802.11ad router sold in the United States is a huge misnomer and a pretty blatant false advertising campaign. One of my students who was interning at one of the big box stores working in their technical support department actually found an 802.11ad router being sold in their stores, and I thought it was quite comical because really you're getting nowhere near the performance of an 802.11ac router when you're dealing with AD, simply because you cannot utilize that 60 gigahertz frequency band. We're almost done with 802.11, and the rest of this video is going to move pretty quickly, but do bear in mind that there is one more standard. 802.11ac has been replaced, even though most of your home consumer routers sold today still adhere only to the AC standard. 802.11ax is basically just an upgrade in all categories for the 802.11 standard. 802.11ax has a lot of conflicting information when it comes to just how fast this technology actually is. I've seen estimates that go all the way up to 36 gigabits per second, which puts it about in line with 802.3ba standard for speed. However, this is laboratory only performance. This is where you have absolute perfect conditions occurring inside a Faraday cage with absolutely no outside interference whatsoever. In an enterprise deployment, you're probably not going to see anything exceeding 1 gigabit per user just because they need to be able to split that bandwidth among multiple users. The implications are awesome, but the 802.11ax rollout has been extremely slow thanks to things like the COVID-19 pandemic and just a general frugality that is hitting a lot of enterprise networks as a result of the economic uncertainty. With that, we're ready to move on from the 802.11 standard. Now, I mentioned there were two others that we really need to talk about. One of them is the 802.15 standard. The 802.15 standard has two major branches that we need to discuss: 802.15.1 and 802.15.4. The 802.15.1 standard is normally equated to Bluetooth. Now, Bluetooth actually has three different categories or classes of use. Each class of use is kind of a trade-off between distance and data rate. The longer distance you transmit, the less data you can effectively transmit. The shorter the distance, the more data you can transmit. Class 1 Bluetooth is designed for basically factory floors. If you need some sort of device that needs monitored wirelessly. If you have a device on a factory floor that does not have an Ethernet jack available, you probably need some sort of wireless monitoring equipment in order to make sure that it's operating as intended. Bluetooth Class 1 is designed to transmit up to 100 meters in distance and is normally for very low data rates. What constitutes a very low data rate? I'm not sure. That's just the term I see thrown out the most in textbooks that specify the difference between Class 1, 2, and 3 Bluetooth. But we are talking about small amounts of data normally represented in clear text rather than images or video footage. Class 2 Bluetooth is the Bluetooth we're all familiar with. Class 2 Bluetooth is something that operates at extremely close ranges and is normally for medium data transfers. Maybe you can stream music or maybe even video with it, and this is normally for a distance of about 10 meters. This is why the majority of Class 2 Bluetooth implementation is for close range AV implementation, whether you're using it for something like a wireless headset, or you're using something like earbuds, or you just have a giant boombox that you like to listen to music on. Ironically, I didn't pre-stage those, I just have all of my Bluetooth crap sitting on my desk. Class 3 is the exact opposite of Class 1. Class 3 is designed for lots of data exchanged very quickly, but it has a maximum transmission distance of about 1 meter. So if you're more than 3 feet away, odds are you can't use Class 1 Bluetooth. A great example of Class 1 Bluetooth would be if you're trying to do a phone-to-phone transfer when you upgrade your cell phone. A lot of cell phone vendors provide for phone-to-phone transfers so that all of your information from your old one can go to your new one. This is probably going to be taking place via Class 3 Bluetooth, where it's designed for high amounts of data, but at extremely close proximity. The other 802.15 standard is 802.15.4. You see this in wireless metropolitan area networks. You're seeing this a lot when it comes to smart cities, where you see things like smart parking meters and smart traffic signals and all of that cool stuff. You basically need some sort of wireless device put in your car in order to effectively utilize it, and this allows sensors to read the proximity of your device and begin charging you if you park in a specific parking spot, or it allows you to trip a signal on a traffic light to let it know that you are waiting in queue for the next green light. This is normally accomplished using the Zigbee protocol. Zigbee is very similar to Bluetooth, but it's a little bit different in its application. Versus Bluetooth that's normally used for wireless personal area networks or at most smart homes, Zigbee was designed to move from home up to neighborhood and even city level. And finally, we have 802.16. 802.16 is often referred to as WiMAX. If you live in a rural area, you're probably not going to have the benefit of physical wired infrastructure leading cable and DSL to your house. This really only leaves you with two options for internet access: either satellite internet, which is highly unreliable and very expensive for low data rates, or you can use WiMAX. WiMAX is microwave internet access. You see this in rural areas where you have a tower that looks pretty indistinguishable from a cell phone tower to the non-initiated, and this allows them to broadcast wirelessly over a distance of about 10 miles. This means that instead of having to physically run miles and miles and miles of cable to every single individual home, in the hopes that someone living in that home will actually subscribe to the services provided by that physical cable infrastructure, instead all an internet service provider has to do is drop a tower in the middle of a cornfield, and they can reach any house with a direct line of sight to that tower. And this is why the 802.16 WiMAX protocol is so heavily favored when it comes to rural areas of the United States. There are a lot of drawbacks to it, but really those go beyond the scope of most of your technical certifications in networking. And with that said, I think we're ready to wrap up. The 802 standard has many different branches, and each of these branches have several revisions or branches of themselves. It can get really difficult to memorize all these different numbers. But don't lose heart. Once you've got these memorized, they're pretty universal. So whether you're studying for an A+ certification, a Net+ certification, a Cisco certification, a cybersecurity, they're all going to want you to know these standards because they all want you to know how networks are constructed in order to better protect them. Once you've got them memorized, they're pretty much stuck with you for life until, you know, they're deprecated and then you have to learn a new standard. However, it's a lot easier to learn one new standard at a time than it is to learn 25 at a time. I get that this one was a little bit on the cut and dry side. I'm sorry about that, but this is important information. If you have any questions or comments, please drop them below, and I will see you all here next time at Brain Melt University.